The moment the slap echoed, I realized how quickly a life could fall apart in front of strangers. The sound didn't feel real at first, like something staged for someone else's drama, not mine. Not in a place like this where the lights were warm and the air smelled like truffle butter and expensive wine, where people laughed in soft, controlled tones like nothing bad could ever touch them. But my cheek burned anyway, sharp and immediate, grounding me in a reality I didn't choose. I stood there frozen, tray still in my hands, the weight of it suddenly unbearable, glasses trembling against each other with a faint, fragile clink that seemed too loud in the silence that followed. And no one moved. Not the manager who had warned me to smile no matter what. Not the guests who had been watching just seconds ago. Not even the man sitting at the center of the table. The one everyone had subtly adjusted around all night without ever saying his name. The one I had noticed the moment he walked in because the entire room shifted like gravity had changed. I should have said something, should have apologized again, or walked away, or done anything other than stand there like I'd forgotten how to exist. But my mind was blank except for the sting on my skin and the quiet humiliation creeping up my spine, the kind that doesn't shout but settles deep, heavy and suffocating. And across from me, she smiled, not loud, not cruel in an obvious way, just enough to make it clear that this was normal to her, that I was just another inconvenience in her perfectly controlled world. I swallowed, tasting something metallic, and forced my voice to work. I'm sorry. The words came out smaller than I intended, like they belonged to someone weaker, someone easier to ignore. And maybe that's exactly what I was in a place like this, a girl balancing bills and double shifts, pretending I belonged in a room where a single dinner cost more than my rent, where people wore confidence like it was tailored into their clothes. I lowered my eyes, not out of submission, but because I knew how this worked. You apologize, you step back, you disappear, and the moment passes like it never mattered. But something felt different this time, something I couldn't name yet, like the air had thickened, like the silence wasn't just awkward but waiting. I felt it before I saw it, that shift, subtle but undeniable. And when I finally looked up, my gaze didn't go to her, didn't go to the manager or the watching crowd. It went to him, because somehow I knew he was the only one who mattered in that moment. And he was already looking at me, not at my mistake, not at the spill or the trembling tray, but at me, steady, unreadable, like he was seeing something no one else bothered to notice. And for a second, just a second, the noise in my head quieted, replaced by something else, something unfamiliar and unsettling, like being seen when you've spent your whole life blending into the background. Then his chair moved, the soft scrape against the floor cutting through the silence more sharply than anything else had, and every head in the room turned. Not because of the sound, but because of what it meant. Because people like him didn't move without reason, didn't speak without consequence. And I felt my heartbeat stumble, unsure whether to brace for more humiliation or something worse. Because men like him weren't known for kindness, weren't known for stepping in, and yet he stood anyway, slow, controlled, like he had all the time in the world, like nothing about this moment surprised him. And when he finally spoke, his voice wasn't loud. Didn't need to be. It carried through the room effortlessly, calm and precise. Apologize. And at first I thought he was speaking to me, that this was just another layer of the same expectation, another reminder of my place. But then I realized he wasn't even looking at me anymore. His attention had shifted, sharp and focused, and the room held its breath as the meaning settled in. Because he hadn't just said a word, he had drawn a line, and suddenly, nothing about this night felt predictable anymore. No one laughed this time, not even her, because something in his tone made it clear this was not a suggestion, not a polite correction wrapped in social etiquette. It was a command, quiet and absolute, the kind that did not need to be repeated. And yet she smiled anyway, slow and practiced, tilting her head just slightly as if she had heard something amusing instead of something dangerous. I think you are misunderstanding, Victoria said, her voice smooth like silk over glass, composed, controlled, completely unshaken. And for a second I wondered if I had imagined the shift, if I had mistaken a passing moment for something more, because people like her did not get corrected, not in rooms like this, not by anyone. But then I saw the way the man across from her did not move, did not blink, did not even breathe differently, and that was when I understood that this was not over. Not even close. My fingers tightened around the tray, the edge pressing into my palm hard enough to anchor me, to keep me from drifting into that familiar place where I told myself none of this mattered, that it was just a job, just another night. But it did matter, not because of the slap, not because of the embarrassment that still lingered like heat under my skin, but because of the way the room had changed, the way every person present was now watching without pretending not to, waiting for something they could not name but could definitely feel. She made a mistake, Victoria continued, gesturing vaguely in my direction without looking at me, like I was an object she did not need to acknowledge directly. And I corrected it. Her lips curved slightly, confident, assured, like this explanation would settle everything, like the world would fall back into its proper order the moment she spoke. And for a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The silence stretched, thin and fragile, like it might snap under the weight of what was about to come. Then he took a step forward, not rushed, not aggressive, just deliberate, each movement measured in a way that made it impossible to ignore, and I felt my breath catch without meaning to, because up close, the quiet around him was even more intense, like standing near something powerful enough to change everything without raising its voice. That is not a correction, he said, his tone still calm, still even, but there was something underneath it now, something sharper, something that made the words land heavier than they should have. And for the first time since this started, Victoria's expression shifted, just slightly, just enough to break the perfect composure she had been wearing like armor. Adrian, she said, softer now, as if trying to pull him back into something familiar, something she understood. Do not make this into something unnecessary. Unnecessary. The word echoed in my mind, strange and misplaced, because nothing about this felt unnecessary to me. It felt defining, like one of those moments that quietly redraws the lines of who you are and where you stand in the world. He did not respond to her name, did not soften, did not step back. Instead, his gaze moved, not to the crowd, not to the manager who now looked like he wished he could disappear into the polished floor, but back to me. And that look was different this time, not just observant, not just distant. There was intention in it, clear and unmistakable, like he had made a decision I did not understand yet. Look at her, he said, and it took me a second to realize he was still speaking to Victoria, still holding her in that invisible line he had drawn. And say it properly. The words were simple, almost gentle in their phrasing, but nothing about them felt optional, and the room seemed to lean in, the quiet pressing closer, heavier, as if even the walls were waiting to see what would happen next. And standing there, caught between them, I realized something I had never allowed myself to consider before, that sometimes power does not shout. It does not demand attention with noise or force. Sometimes it simply decides, and everything else adjusts around it. And for the first time since the night began, I was no longer invisible inside it. Victoria did not move at first, and that hesitation was enough to shift everything. Because a moment ago she had owned the room without trying, and now she stood in it like someone who had just realized the ground beneath her was not as stable as she believed, her fingers tightening slightly around the stem of her glass, the only sign that something inside her had changed. You are serious, she said quietly. Not to me, not even fully to him, but to the space between them, like she was testing whether this version of him was real, whether this line he had drawn would actually hold. Adrian did not answer her question. He did not need to. The silence that followed was answer enough, heavy and unmoving, and I felt it settle over my shoulders, over my chest, pressing in a way that made it harder to breathe but impossible to look away, because this was no longer about a mistake. No longer about a spill or a moment of embarrassment. This was something deeper, something I could not fully understand but could feel unfolding in real time. You are asking me to apologize to her, Victoria said, and there was something sharper in her voice now, something edged with disbelief, as if saying it out loud might make it less real, might give her a way to reject it, to step back into the version of the night she had expected. But Adrian's expression did not change, not even slightly. I am telling you to, he replied, and the difference between those two sentences landed like a quiet echo through the room. I could feel eyes on me again, not dismissive this time, not indifferent, but curious, measuring, like everyone was trying to understand how I had somehow become the center of something they did not dare interrupt. and I wanted to disappear. Part of me still did. The part that had learned to survive by staying small, by avoiding attention, by accepting that some things were not worth fighting. But another part of me, quieter but stronger, held me in place, refusing to let me step back, refusing to let this moment slip past like all the others had. Victoria let out a soft breath, almost a laugh, but not quite, shaking her head slightly, as if this was all some kind of misunderstanding that would resolve itself if she waited long enough. "This is not appropriate," she said, her voice regaining some of its earlier control, that polished certainty she wore so well. "You are making a scene." And for a second I thought that might work, that the weight of expectation, of reputation, of everything that came with being someone like him would pull him back, would remind him of the rules people like them lived by. But instead, something in his gaze hardened, not with anger, not with anything loud or obvious, but with clarity, the kind that does not leave room for negotiation. "No," he said, and that single word cut through everything, simple and final. "This is me correcting one." And I felt something shift again, not just in the room, but inside me, like a door opening. Just enough to let in a possibility I had never considered before, that maybe this was not just about him, not just about power or control or whatever invisible forces govern people like him. Maybe this was also about choice, about the lines people decide to draw and the ones they refuse to cross. Victoria's eyes flicked to me then, really looking at me for the first time since this began. And the expression there was different now, not just dismissive or annoyed, but searching, trying to understand what she had missed, what she had underestimated. And I held her gaze without meaning to, without planning it, just standing there as myself. Not smaller, not apologizing, just present. And for a brief, suspended second, it felt like the entire room was balanced on that moment, waiting to see which way it would fall. Then she exhaled slowly, her shoulders lifting and falling in a controlled motion. And when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, stripped of some of its earlier edge. "I am not doing this," she said. But there was a crack in it now, faint but undeniable, like the beginning of something breaking, and Adrian did not argue, did not raise his voice or push further. He simply looked at her, steady and unwavering, and said, "Then you are done here." And the meaning of that sentence did not settle all at once. It moved through the room in a slow wave, recognition dawning in stages, in the way people straightened slightly, in the way the manager's eyes widened, in the way Victoria went completely still, and I felt my own breath catch as I realized that whatever I thought this night was going to be, whatever I thought my place in it was, it had already changed beyond anything I could have imagined. The words did not explode. They did not need to. They settled instead, heavy and irreversible, like something final had just been written into the air. And for a moment no one reacted, not because they did not understand, but because they understood too well. Victoria's face went still in a way that felt more dangerous than anger, her expression smoothing out into something controlled, something practiced, but her eyes gave her away. Just for a second, just long enough to show that she had not expected this, not here, not in front of an audience that suddenly felt very real. "Adrian," she said again, but this time his name sounded different, less like a reminder of connection and more like a question she did not want answered. "You are overreacting." The words were precise, carefully chosen, like she was trying to restore order through logic, through the rules that usually worked in her favor. But he did not respond immediately, and that silence stretched, deliberate and unhurried, forcing everyone to sit in it, to feel it. I realized then that this was how power actually worked, not loud, not chaotic, but patient, willing to let the weight of a moment do the work instead of rushing to fill it. I shifted slightly where I stood, the tray still in my hands now forgotten, my fingers numb from holding it too tightly, and I wondered if I should step back, if I should leave, if I should remove myself from something that had clearly grown beyond me. But my feet did not move, not because I wanted to stay, but because something told me this was not a moment you walked away from, not if you wanted to understand it. "No," Adrian said finally, his voice quiet but absolute. "I am correcting something I should have addressed a long time ago." And that sentence changed everything, not just for her, but for me, because it meant this was not about a single moment, not about a mistake or a reaction. This was something that had been building, something that had reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. Victoria's lips parted slightly, like she was about to respond, but no words came out right away, and the room seemed to lean in again, waiting, always waiting, and when she did speak, her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "You are choosing her over me," she said, and there was something fragile under the accusation, something that made it less about me and more about what she thought she was losing. I felt that sentence land on me like something misplaced, something I had not asked for and did not understand, because this was never about choosing me. It could not be. I was just a waitress, just a stranger who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Adrian's expression did not shift, did not soften. "This is not about her," he replied, and for a second I felt something tighten in my chest, something small and unreasonable that I pushed down immediately, because of course it was not about me. It never was. "This is about what I allow," he continued, and the clarity in his voice made the words settle deeper than anything else he had said. Victoria let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it, only disbelief. "And you are willing to end this over a waitress," she said, the word carrying less disdain now and more confusion, like she was trying to understand how something so small could have such a large consequence. And Adrian looked at her then, fully, completely, not avoiding, not dismissing, just meeting her gaze with something steady and unyielding. "I am willing to end this because you thought you could do that and nothing would happen," he said, and there was no anger in it, just truth, plain and unadorned, and that made it hit harder than anything louder ever could. The silence that followed felt different this time, not tense but settled, like something had already been decided and the rest was just catching up, and I became aware again of where I was, of the eyes still on me, of the faint sting still lingering on my skin, but it felt distant now, less defining, like it belonged to a version of me from a few minutes ago, not the one standing here now. Victoria straightened slightly, her shoulders pulling back as if she was rebuilding herself in real time, piece by piece, and when she spoke again, her voice was composed, but it no longer carried the same weight it had before. "You will regret this," she said, not as a threat, but as a certainty she needed to believe, and Adrian did not argue, did not reassure, did not engage with it at all. He simply stepped aside, a small movement that created space, not just physically, but symbolically. And in that moment it became clear that whatever they had been, whatever this had been leading to, it was already over. I watched as she turned, not hurried, not broken, just controlled, walking away with the same measured steps she had entered with. But something about it felt different, like the illusion had shifted, like the room saw her differently now. And as the door closed behind her, the quiet that followed was no longer heavy. It was open, uncertain, like something new had just begun, and I realized, standing there in the middle of it, that this night was not just about what had happened. It was about what came next, and I had a feeling I was already part of it whether I wanted to be or not. For a few seconds after the door closed, no one spoke, like the entire restaurant had forgotten how, like the sound of her heels fading into the hallway had taken something with it, something that left behind a silence too clean, too sharp to break easily, and I stood there still holding the tray, realizing I had not moved since any of this began, my body locked in a moment that had already passed. Then the world started again, slowly, cautiously, like people were unsure if it was safe. Conversations returning in low murmurs, glasses lifting, forks touching plates, but nothing felt the same, not really, because every glance that passed over me now lingered a second longer than it should have, not dismissive anymore, not indifferent, but aware, and I did not know what to do with that kind of attention. I lowered the tray carefully onto the nearest empty table, my hands unsteady in a way I could not hide, and I became suddenly aware of everything at once, the warmth of the lights, the faint music in the background, the tightness in my chest that had not fully released yet, and the man standing just a few feet away, still, composed, like nothing about what had just happened had cost him anything at all. I should have said thank you. The thought came to me quickly, automatic, because that is what you say when someone steps in, when someone changes the outcome of a moment you could not control. But the words did not come, not because I did not feel them, but because they felt too small, too simple for something that had shifted the ground under my feet. Instead, I found myself looking at him again. Really looking this time. Not the way I had before when he was just another presence in the room, important but distant, but now with the understanding that he had chosen to act, that he had stepped into something that had nothing to do with him and made it matter. His gaze met mine almost immediately, like he had expected it, like he had been waiting for it. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the space between us filled with something quiet and unspoken that I did not know how to name. "Are you hurt?" he asked finally, his voice lower now, not carrying across the room the way it had before, but still clear, still precise. And the question caught me off guard. Not because of what it meant, but because of how it was asked, not as an assumption, not as a formality, but as something real. I shook my head quickly, the motion automatic. "I am fine," I said, and even as the words left my mouth, I realized how often I had said them without thinking, how easily they came, like a reflex I had trained into myself. But this time he did not just accept it, did not nod and move on the way most people would. He held my gaze a second longer, like he was measuring the truth of it, like he was deciding whether to believe me. "You should not have to be," he said, and the sentence settled into me in a way I was not prepared for. Simple and quiet, but carrying a weight I could not ignore, because no one had ever said that to me before. No one had ever suggested that being fine was not the goal, that maybe there was something more than just getting through moments like this without breaking. I looked away first, not because I wanted to, but because I did not know how to stand in that kind of attention for too long. It felt unfamiliar, unsettling in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with being seen in a way I had spent years avoiding. "Thank you," I said finally, the words coming out softer than I intended, but at least they came, at least they existed, and for a second I thought that would be enough, that this would be the end of it, that he would nod and return to his table, and I would pick up my tray and finish my shift. And this would become one of those stories you tell yourself later, something unreal that happened once and never again. But he did not move, did not step away. Instead, he reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, and the room seemed to shift again, subtle but noticeable, like people were paying attention without wanting to appear like they were. And when he pulled his hand back out, there was nothing dramatic in it. No gesture meant to impress, just a simple, folded piece of linen, a clean napkin, which he placed on the table between us. "For your shift," he said, and I frowned slightly, confused, because I did not understand what he meant, not fully, until I noticed the faint marks still on my skin reflected in the polished surface of a nearby glass. And something about the gesture, about the fact that he had noticed and chosen to acknowledge it without making it into something bigger, something public, made my chest tighten in a different way. I reached for the napkin slowly, my fingers brushing against the fabric, soft and crisp, and for a moment I just held it, unsure why this felt more significant than everything else that had happened, unsure why this small, quiet act seemed to linger more than the loud ones. When I looked up again, he was still watching me, but there was no expectation in it, no demand, just a calm presence that felt steady in a way I could not explain. And that was when I realized that whatever this was, whatever had started tonight, it was not finished, not even close, and somehow, without asking, without choosing, I had already stepped into it. The napkin felt heavier than it should have, like it carried something more than just fabric, something unspoken that I could not quite define, and I realized I was still standing there while the rest of the restaurant had already moved on, or at least pretended to, the soft hum of conversation returning in careful waves. But underneath it, there was a different kind of awareness now, a quiet tension that had not been there before, like everyone had witnessed something they were not supposed to see and were still deciding what to do with it. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to move, to step back into the version of the night that had existed before everything shifted, because I still had a job to do, still had tables waiting, orders to take, a manager who would not care about what happened as long as service continued without disruption. And yet nothing about me felt the same as it had 30 minutes ago, like I had stepped into a different version of myself without fully understanding how. I picked up the tray again, the familiar weight grounding me just enough to function, and turned away, not because I wanted to leave that moment behind, but because I did not know how to stay in it any longer, without losing whatever fragile control I had left. And as I moved through the tables, I felt it, the difference, the way people looked at me now, Not dismissive, not impatient, but curious, almost cautious, like I had become something unexpected in a place that did not allow for surprises. Lily. My manager's voice cut through my thoughts, low but urgent, and I turned to find him standing just a few feet away. His expression tight in a way I had never seen before, not angry, not exactly, but strained, like he was balancing something he could not afford to drop. "Are you all right?" he asked, and the question sounded different coming from him. Less about concern and more about control, about making sure the situation did not spiral into something worse, something that could cost the restaurant more than just a single disrupted evening. I nodded quickly, the reflex automatic. "I am fine," I said again. And this time he accepted it without question, because for him, fine was all that mattered. Fine meant I could keep working. Fine meant the night could continue. Fine meant nothing else needed to be addressed. He glanced past me briefly, toward the table where Adrian had already returned, sitting as if nothing had happened, composed, detached, but somehow more present than before, and I noticed the way my manager straightened slightly, adjusting his posture without realizing it. Like even he was not immune to whatever quiet authority that man carried. "Just be careful," he added, lowering his voice further, and I almost smiled at the irony of it, because careful had never been enough, not in situations like this, not when the rules shifted depending on who you were and what you could afford, but I nodded anyway, because that was what you did. You nodded, you agreed, you kept moving. I turned back to my section, stepping into the rhythm of service again, taking orders, refilling glasses, offering polite smiles that felt easier now, not because anything had become simpler, but because something inside me had changed, something small but solid, like a line had been drawn where there had not been one before. And yet, no matter how much I tried to focus, my attention kept pulling back to him, to the table where he sat surrounded by people who spoke to him with a kind of careful respect, their voices measured, their movements controlled, and I wondered what it was like to live in a world where your presence alone could change the outcome of a moment, where a single word could shift the balance of an entire room. I caught his gaze once, just for a second, and this time I did not look away immediately, not because I was trying to prove something, but because I did not feel the same instinct to retreat, to make myself smaller, and something in his expression shifted. Almost imperceptible, like he had noticed that too. The rest of the shift passed in a blur, time moving strangely, too fast and too slow at the same time, until eventually the tables emptied, the music softened, and the lights dimmed just slightly, signaling the end of the night, and I found myself in the back hallway, leaning against the cool wall, the napkin still in my hand, now slightly wrinkled from how tightly I had been holding it. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me, trying to process everything that had happened, trying to convince myself that this was just another night, just another story that would fade with time. But deep down I knew that was not true, because moments like this did not disappear. They stayed. They shifted something inside you that could not be undone. Footsteps echoed softly from the main dining room, steady and unhurried, and I opened my eyes without meaning to, already knowing who it would be before I even saw him, because there was something about the way he moved that made it impossible to mistake, and as he stepped into the hallway, the distance between us narrowing again, I realized with a quiet certainty that whatever this was, whatever had started tonight, it was not finished, not for him, and not for me either. "You stayed," he said, and it was not a question, not really, more like an observation that had already been confirmed, and I straightened slightly from where I had been leaning against the wall, the cool surface at my back suddenly feeling less steady now that he was standing in front of me, closer than before, closer than anyone like him had ever stood to someone like me without a reason I could understand. "I work here," I replied, and the words sounded smaller than I intended, not because they were wrong, but because they felt incomplete, like they did not explain why I was still here in this moment, why I had not left as soon as my shift ended, why I was still holding onto a piece of fabric like it meant something more than it should. His gaze dropped briefly to my hand, to the napkin I had not let go of, and something in his expression shifted, subtle but noticeable, like he was cataloging details the way he had done earlier, taking in more than I realized I was showing. "Most people would have left," he said, his voice calm, measured, the same tone he had used all night, But here in the quiet hallway it felt different, more focused, less distant, and I hesitated before answering. Because he was right. Most people would have. Most people would have walked out, called it a bad night, something to forget, but I was not most people, not in the ways that mattered. Most people do not have rent due in 3 days. I said finally, the truth slipping out before I could soften it, before I could shape it into something more acceptable. And for a second I expected something to change in his expression, expected him to react in a way that reminded me of the difference between us. But he did not. He just watched me, steady and unreadable, like that detail fit into whatever picture he was already forming. Lily Carter, he said. And hearing my name in his voice made something tighten in my chest. Not fear, not exactly, but awareness, sharp and immediate. You handle pressure well. And I let out a small breath that might have been a laugh if it had not felt so fragile. I handle necessity. I corrected, because that was what it was, not strength, not resilience. Just the simple reality of having no other option. He nodded slightly, like he understood the distinction, like he respected it in a way that did not feel performative or forced, and that unsettled me more than anything else had, because I did not know how to respond to that kind of attention, to someone seeing something in me that I had always treated as survival, not something worth noticing. What happened out there? I started, then stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence, unsure what I was even trying to ask, because thank you felt too small, and why felt too complicated, and he seemed to understand that pause, that unfinished thought, because he answered anyway. It was not about you, he said, and the words landed exactly where I expected them to, logical, grounded, reinforcing the distance between us. But then he added, but it involved you, and that changed the shape of it, just slightly, enough to make me look at him differently. You did not have to step in, I said, because that was the part one could not reconcile, the part that did not fit into any version of the world I understood, and he held my gaze for a moment before responding. I decide what I have to do, he said simply, and there was no arrogance in it, no need to justify or explain, just a statement of fact that felt as solid as everything else about him. I shifted my weight slightly, the hallway suddenly feeling smaller, more contained, like this. Conversation existed outside of everything else, separate from the restaurant, from the night, from the life I had been living up until this point. And I realized that I was not just standing in a moment. I was standing at the edge of something I could not see clearly yet, but could feel approaching. Does it always work like that? I asked before I could stop myself, the question quiet but real. Do people just change things because you say so? And for the first time, something like a hint of amusement flickered in his expression, not a smile, not quite, but close enough to soften the edges of it. No, he said. Only when they believe there will be consequences if they do not. And the way he said it was not threatening, not directed at me, just honest, like he was explaining a rule of a world I had never been part of. I absorbed that in silence, the idea settling slowly, because it made sense in a way I did not want it to, in a way that felt too close to the truth of things I had seen but never named. And what happens now? I asked, not because I expected an answer, but because I needed to hear how he would frame it, how he would define whatever came next. And he studied me for a moment, like he was considering how much to say, how much I needed to know, before answering. That depends on you, he said. And that was not the answer I expected, not the one I was prepared for, because until this moment, nothing about tonight had felt like a choice I got to make. And yet here he was, placing something in front of me that felt exactly like that. The hallway seemed quieter then, the world beyond it distant, and I realized that whatever path this night had set in motion, it was not just his anymore, it was mine too, and for the first time in a long time, I did not know which direction I was supposed to take. His words did not leave me right away, they lingered, echoing in the quiet space between us, settling somewhere deeper than I was comfortable admitting, because choice had never sounded like that before, not something handed to me calmly, not something that came without pressure or urgency, and I realized I did not know what to do with it, not yet. I shifted slightly, my fingers tightening around the napkin again, grounding myself in something tangible while my thoughts tried to catch up with everything that had just changed, and for the first time since this night began, I felt something unfamiliar rise up through the confusion, not fear, not uncertainty, but something quieter, steadier, like the beginning of clarity. You said it depends on me, I said slowly, choosing each word carefully, because this felt like a moment where what I said actually mattered. But I do not even know what the options are. And that was the truth of it. I was standing at the edge of something without knowing what direction led forward or what stepping away would cost. Adrian watched me in that same composed way, like he was not surprised by the question, like he had expected it. And there was no impatience in his expression, no sense that I was taking too long or asking for too much. Just a quiet acknowledgement that this was part of the process, whatever that process was. You can walk away, he said, and the simplicity of it made me blink, because I had expected something more complicated, something that came with conditions or consequences already attached. But he continued, finish your shift, go home, forget tonight happened. And for a moment, I let myself imagine that, walking out of here, going back to my small apartment, waking up tomorrow and telling myself this was just a strange story, something unreal that did not belong to my life. But even as the thought formed, I knew it was not true, because moments like this did not fade that easily. They left marks you could not ignore, even if no one else could see them. And the other option, I asked, my voice quieter now, not because I was afraid, but because this felt like a line I was stepping closer to without fully understanding it. He did not answer immediately, and that pause felt intentional, like he was giving me space to consider what I was asking before he said anything that might shape it too much. And when he did speak, his tone was the same as always, calm, steady. But there was something else beneath it now, something more direct. You stop pretending. You are invisible, he said, and the words landed harder than anything else he had said tonight, because they reached into something I had never said out loud, something I had built my entire life around without naming it. And I felt my breath catch, just slightly, just enough to remind me that this was not as simple as choosing between two paths. This was about changing the way I saw myself entirely. That is not something I can just decide, I said, and there was no defensiveness in it, just honesty, because it was true. You do not wake up one day and become someone else. You do not rewrite years of survival with a single choice. And he nodded once, like he understood that too, like he was not expecting something unrealistic, just something intentional. No, he agreed. But you can decide what you accept, and that felt different, more tangible, something I could actually hold on to, because it was not about becoming someone new. It was about recognizing something that had already been there, something I had ignored or pushed aside because it was easier, because it was safer. I looked down at the napkin in my hand again, the fabric now creased and slightly worn from how tightly I had held it, and I realized it was not just a piece of cloth anymore. It was a reminder of a moment where someone had stepped in and said that what happened was not acceptable, not normal, not something to just move past. And for the first time, I let myself consider that maybe he was right. Maybe I had been accepting things I did not have to. Maybe I had been choosing the easier path without realizing there was another one. If I do not walk away, I said slowly, lifting my gaze back to his, then what? And this time there was no hesitation in his answer, no pause to soften or adjust it. Then you step into something different, he said. And the way he said it made it clear that different did not mean easy, did not mean safe, but it also did not mean impossible. And I felt something shift again, not outside of me this time, but inside, like a door opening just enough to let in the possibility that I had more control than I thought, more say in how my life unfolded than I had ever allowed myself to believe. The hallway felt quieter now, not because the world beyond it had stopped, but because my focus had narrowed, everything outside of this moment fading into the background as I stood there, realizing that whatever I chose next would not just define the rest of this night. It would define something much bigger, something that had been building long before I ever stepped into this restaurant. I took a slow breath, steadying myself, not because I had all the answers, but because I understood something I had not before. That standing still was also a choice, that walking away was not the same as moving forward. And for the first time, I felt like I was not just reacting to what happened to me, I was deciding what came next, and that realization, more than anything else, made it impossible to go back to who I had been before. For the first time in my life, I did not answer right away, and that alone felt like a shift, like I had stepped out of a pattern I had followed for years without questioning. Because usually I would have chosen the safest option, the one that kept everything predictable, the one that did not risk anything beyond what I could already handle. But standing here now, with his words still settling in my chest, that choice did not feel the same anymore. I let out a slow breath, my fingers loosening slightly around the napkin as I looked at him. Really looked this time, not as someone untouchable or distant, but as someone who had just offered me something I had never been given before. Not help, not protection, but perspective. And that felt far more dangerous, because it meant I could not go back to not knowing. I do not think I can pretend nothing happened, I said quietly, and even as the words left my mouth, I felt something steady in them, something certain, like I was not just speaking but deciding. And his gaze did not shift, did not change, but there was something in it that acknowledged that, something that told me he understood exactly what that meant. Good, he said, simple and direct, and that was it. No praise, no reassurance, just a recognition that I had taken the first step on my own, and somehow that felt more solid than anything else he could have said. I swallowed, the air in the hallway feeling different now, lighter but sharper, like everything was more defined. And I realized that this was the part where things usually became unclear, where decisions led to consequences I could not predict. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, I felt focused, like for once I was not reacting to what life threw at me. I was choosing how to meet it. Then what does stepping into something different actually look like? I asked, because I needed to understand what I was agreeing to, what I was opening myself up to, and he tilted his head slightly, considering me in that same measured way, like he was deciding how much to reveal, how much. I needed to know at this point. It starts with not going back to the version of yourself that accepted that, he said, and I knew exactly what he meant without him needing to explain further. The way I had immediately apologized, the way I had tried to make myself smaller to diffuse the situation, the way I had treated what happened like it was something I had to endure instead of something that should not have happened at all. I nodded slowly, because that part made sense. It was clear, actionable, something I could hold on to. But there was still something else, something unspoken that I could feel hovering just beneath the surface, and I found myself asking the question before I could stop it. And you? I said, my voice steady despite the weight of it. Where do you fit into that? Because whether I liked it or not, he was part of this now, part of whatever path had opened up tonight, and I needed to understand what that meant. For a moment, he did not answer, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable, not uncertain, just deliberate, like he was choosing his words with the same care he applied to everything else. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, unchanged, but there was something more defined in it now, something that felt less like observation and more like intention. I do not interfere unless I decide it matters, he said, and I felt that sentence settle into me, not as a warning, but as a boundary, something clear and unambiguous. And he continued, tonight, it mattered. And there it was again, that quiet certainty, that ability to define a moment without needing anyone else to agree with it. I held his gaze, absorbing that, understanding that whatever this was, it was not something casual, not something temporary. It was something that came with its own rules, its own structure, and if I stepped into it, I would have to be willing to understand that. And if something like that happens again, I asked, because this was the part that mattered, the part that would determine whether this was just a moment or something more. What then? And this time, there was no pause, no hesitation, just a direct answer that came as naturally as everything else he had said. Then you decide first, he said, and something about that shifted everything again, because it put the responsibility back on me, not on him, not on anyone else, but on me. And he added, and if it still matters, I will see it. And I understood what he meant, not that he would always be there, not that he would step in every time, but that he was aware, that he paid attention in a way most people did not, and that if something crossed a line he recognized, it would not be ignored. I let that settle, the weight of it, the implication of it, and for the first time since this night began, I felt something that was not just clarity or determination, but something closer to anticipation, like I was standing at the beginning of something I had not planned but could not avoid, and instead of shrinking from it, I found myself leaning into it, just slightly, just enough to acknowledge that this was real, that this was happening, and that I was no longer the same person who had walked into this restaurant hours ago. thinking this was just another shift to survive. The hallway felt different now, not smaller but sharper, like every detail had come into focus and there was no stepping back into the blur of before, and I realized that what he had given me was not protection, not even opportunity in the way I had always understood it, but something far more unsettling, the responsibility to decide how I would be treated moving forward. I shifted my weight slightly. The napkin still in my hand, no longer just a reminder of what happened, but something closer. To a marker, a point where things had divided into before and after, and I found myself wondering how many moments like this I had missed, how many times I had accepted something I did not have to simply because no one had ever told me otherwise. If I decide differently, I said slowly, my voice steady but thoughtful, then everything changes, and it was not a question, not really. More like I was saying it out loud to understand the weight of it, to hear how it sounded in the air instead of just in my head. Adrian watched me without interrupting, giving the thoughts space to land, and that silence felt intentional, like he was allowing me to reach the conclusion on my own instead of handing it to me. And after a moment, he nodded once, a small acknowledgement that what I had said was true. Yes, he said, and there was no hesitation in it. No attempt to soften the reality of that shift. Everything does. And the way he said it made it clear that this was not a warning, not something meant to scare me away, but a simple statement of fact, the kind that did not need to be dressed up to be understood. I let out a quiet breath, feeling that truth settle into me, because change had always been something that happened to me, something I reacted to, something I endured, but this was different. This was change I would be choosing, and that made it heavier, but also clearer. And if I am not ready for that? I asked, because I needed to know what stepping back looked like, what it meant if I chose to stay where I was. And for a moment, he studied me in that same measured way, like he was not just listening to my words, but to everything behind them. And when he spoke, his tone did not shift, did not become softer or harder, just remained steady. Then nothing changes, he said. And there was something almost more unsettling about that answer than anything else, because it meant the alternative was not neutral. It was a return, a continuation of the same patterns I had already recognized, the same acceptance of things I now knew I did not have to accept. I nodded slowly, understanding that, feeling it settle into place, because it meant there was no middle ground here, no safe space where I could take a little from this moment and leave the rest behind. I either stepped forward or I stayed exactly where I had been. The quiet between us stretched again, but it felt different now, less uncertain, more like a pause before movement, and I became aware of how still I had been standing, how long this moment had lasted compared to everything else in my life that usually moved too fast to process. You are not telling me what to do, I said, more to confirm it than to question it. And he shook his head once, simple and clear. No, he replied, because if I did, it would not be your decision. And something about that settled the last piece of hesitation inside me, because it meant whatever came next would belong to me, fully, without conditions or expectations tied to him. I glanced down at the napkin one more time, then folded it carefully, deliberately, not out of habit but out of intention, like I was acknowledging what it represented before deciding what to do with it. And when I looked back up, my gaze felt steadier, more certain than it had at any point tonight. I do not want to go back, I said, and the words felt solid in a way that surprised me. Not rushed, not forced, just true. And for a moment, he did not respond, just watched me with that same quiet focus, like he was confirming that I meant it, that I understood what I was saying. Then he nodded once, and there was something final in that gesture, something that felt less like approval and more like recognition, like I had crossed a line he had been waiting to see if I would approach. Then you will not, he said, and the simplicity of it made it feel even more real, because there was no dramatic shift, no sudden change in the world around us, just a quiet decision that would carry forward into everything that came after. I felt something settle in my chest then, not relief exactly, but something close to it, like the tension I had been carrying without realizing it had finally found somewhere to go. And for the first time tonight, I felt grounded, not because everything was clear, but because I knew which direction I was facing. Footsteps echoed faintly from the dining room again, the last of the staff finishing up, the night moving toward its natural end, and I realized that this moment, this conversation, was about to become part of something larger, something that extended beyond this hallway, beyond this shift, into whatever came next. I held his gaze for a second longer, aware that this was not an ending, not even close, but the beginning of something I had not planned and could not fully predict. And yet, for the first time, that uncertainty did not feel like something to avoid. It felt like something to step into, and as I straightened, no longer leaning on the wall behind me, I understood that whatever happened after this, I would not be the same person walking into it as the one who had walked in hours ago, and that difference alone was enough to change everything. The moment I said it out loud, something inside me locked into place, not like a door closing, but like one finally opening all the way, and I realized there was no going back to the version of myself that had walked into this building earlier tonight pretending that endurance was the same as strength. Adrian did not say anything else right away, and that silence felt different now, not like a test, not like pressure, but like space. Like he was stepping back just enough to let me stand on my own decision without interference. And for the first time since this night began, I did not feel like I needed him to fill that silence. I straightened my shoulders slightly, not in a dramatic way, not like I was trying to prove something, but because it felt natural now, like my posture was catching up with something that had already shifted internally, and I became aware of how I was standing, how I was breathing, how I was holding myself in a way I had never paid attention to before. Then I guess this is where things change, I said quietly, not as a declaration, not as something meant to impress, but as a simple acknowledgement of what had already happened, and he nodded once. That same subtle motion that carried more weight than anything louder ever could. It already has, he replied, and I understood what he meant, because the change was not something waiting in the future, it was already in motion, already shaping the way I saw myself, the way I interpreted what had happened, the way I would respond the next time something like this occurred. Footsteps echoed faintly from the dining room again, voices low and distant, the staff finishing their closing routines, and I knew that in a few minutes, this hallway would be empty. This moment would dissolve into the rest of the night, and whatever came next would not be contained within these walls anymore. I glanced toward the doorway instinctively, then back at him, and for a brief second, I hesitated, not because I doubted what I had said, but because I realized that stepping forward did not come with instructions. There was no clear path laid out in front of me, just a direction I had chosen without fully knowing where it led. What happens when I walk out of here? I asked, because that felt like the real question now, not about the moment itself, but about everything that followed it. And he considered that for a second, not like he was searching for an answer, but like he was deciding how much of it I needed to hear right now. The same world is still there, he said, and there was no illusion in his voice, no attempt to make it sound easier than it would be. But you will not move through it the same way. And that made sense, more than anything else had, because it was not about the world changing, it was about me no longer fitting into it in the same way I had before. I nodded slowly, absorbing that, feeling the weight of it settle into something solid and usable, something I could carry with me instead of something that would fade once I stepped outside. And if I forget, I said, not because I planned to, but because I knew how easy it was to slip back into old patterns when things became familiar again, when the pressure returned in quieter forms, and for the first time, something in his expression shifted just slightly, not softer, not warmer, but more defined, like he was acknowledging that possibility is real, not as a failure, but as part of the process. Then you remember again, he said. And the simplicity of it surprised me, because I had expected something more complicated, something that required effort or strategy, but instead it was just that, a reminder that slipping did not mean losing everything. It just meant choosing again. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding, and something about that answer settled a piece of uncertainty I had not been able to name, because it meant this was not a one-time decision, not a single moment that would define everything. Forever, it was something ongoing, something I would have to continue choosing again and again, until it became natural. The hallway seemed quieter now, the sounds from the dining room fading as the night moved toward its end, and I realized that this conversation was reaching its own conclusion, not because there was nothing left to say, but because what needed to be said had already been said. I looked at him one more time, really looked, not trying to understand everything about him, not trying to define what role he would play in whatever came next, but just recognizing that he had been part of this moment, part of this shift, in a way that could not be undone. "I will remember," I said, and this time the words did not feel like a reflex, did not feel like something I was supposed to say. They felt intentional, chosen, like everything else had been tonight. And he held my gaze for a second longer before giving a slight nod, not as approval, not as confirmation, but as acknowledgement, like he understood that I meant it. Then, without another word, he stepped back, just enough to create space again, and that movement felt like a signal, not of distance, but of trust, like he was leaving the next step, entirely up to me. And for the first time, that did not feel overwhelming. It felt right, like the weight of the decision belonged exactly where it should, with me. And as I turned toward the doorway, ready to step back into the world beyond this hallway, I understood that nothing about it had changed, and yet everything about how I would move through it had. The door to the dining room felt heavier than it should have, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented, a return to something familiar that no longer fit the same way. And as I pushed it open, the soft glow of the restaurant lights spilled into the hallway, carrying with it the low hum of voices, the clink of glassware, the final movements of a night winding down. And for a brief second, I paused at the threshold, aware that stepping through it was not just about finishing my shift. It was about testing whether what had changed inside me would hold when everything else stayed the same. I stepped forward anyway, my posture different now, not exaggerated, not forced, just aligned in a way that felt natural, like I was no longer trying to disappear into the background, but simply existing without apology, and the difference was subtle but undeniable. I could feel it in the way my shoulders stayed level, in the way my steps did not hesitate, in the way I met the room instead of avoiding it. A few of the remaining guests glanced up as I passed, their expressions flickering with recognition, with curiosity, and for the first time I did not immediately look away. I did not shrink under their attention or try to interpret what they were thinking. I just moved, steady and composed, letting their gaze pass over me without letting it define me. At the service station, one of the other servers, Jenna, looked up as I approached, her eyes widening slightly as she took in my expression, the way I carried myself, and for a moment she said nothing, just studied me like she was trying to understand what had shifted. "Are you okay?" she asked finally, her voice low but genuine, and I nodded. But this time the answer felt different, not automatic, not dismissive. "I am," I said, and for the first time, it felt true in a way it had. Not earlier, not because nothing had happened, but because I was no longer trying to minimize it. She held my gaze for a second longer, then nodded slowly, like she accepted that, like she could see something in me that matched the words, and then she returned to what she was doing, the moment passing without becoming something bigger than it needed to be. I moved through the last of my tasks with a clarity I had never experienced before, every action deliberate, every interaction grounded in something steadier than habit, and I noticed things I had not before. The way the manager's tone softened slightly when he spoke to me. The way a guest who had been dismissive earlier now met my eyes when thanking me. Small shifts that might have gone unnoticed on any other night, but now felt like reflections of something larger. It was not that the world had changed, not really, but I had. And that difference was enough to alter how everything around me responded. When I returned to the table, where he had been sitting, it was empty, the chairs pushed in neatly, the surface cleared, no trace left of the presence that had altered the course of my night except for the memory of it and the quiet understanding that it had been real. I stood there for a second, taking that in, not with disappointment, not with expectation, just with awareness, because this was not about him staying or leaving. It was about what had already been set in motion. I finished the last of my closing duties, the routine movements grounding me in the present, and when the manager finally gave the signal that we were done, I moved toward the back to collect my things, the hallway now empty, the quiet settled in a way that felt different from before, less uncertain, more complete. I paused for a moment in that same spot where everything had shifted, the wall cool against my back again. But this time I did not lean into it the same way. I did not need its support in the same way. I just stood there, present, aware of how far I had come in the span of a single night. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the napkin, now neatly folded, no longer crumpled or held too tightly, and I looked at it for a second. not as something fragile or temporary, but as something that marked a decision, something that reminded me of a line I had chosen not to cross again. I folded it once more, carefully, then placed it back into my pocket, not as something to hold on to out of fear, but as something to carry forward with intention. When I stepped out of the building a few minutes later, the night air felt different against my skin, cooler, sharper. The city around me alive in the way it always was, cars passing, distant, voices echoing, the steady rhythm of a world that had not changed at all. And yet as I walked down the sidewalk, my steps steady and unhurried, I realized that I was not moving through it the same way anymore, that something inside me had shifted in a way that would not fade with time. And as I reached the corner and paused for a brief second before continuing, I understood that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something I had not planned but had chosen, and for the first time, that choice felt like it belonged entirely to me. The strange thing about change is that it does not feel loud when it happens. I thought as I stood at the corner, the city moving around me like it always had, headlights cutting through the dark, people passing without noticing, the rhythm of everything steady and familiar, and yet something inside me had shifted so quietly that no one else would ever see it, but I would feel it in every step I took from this point forward. I started walking again, my pace unhurried, not because I had nowhere to be, but because for the first time, I was not rushing to get through my life. I was actually aware of it, aware of how I moved through it, how I carried myself in it, and that awareness felt like something I had been missing without realizing it. The cool night air brushed against my skin, grounding me in the present, and I reached into my pocket again, my fingers brushing against the folded napkin, not to hold on to it tightly this time, but just to feel it there, a quiet reminder of a moment that had changed more than I understood at first. I thought about everything that had happened, not just the confrontation, not just the way the room had shifted, but the conversation that followed, the words that had settled deeper than I expected, the realization that I had been accepting things simply because I believed I had no other choice, and how quickly that belief had started to unravel once I saw it for what it was. I slowed slightly as I approached a crosswalk, the red hand glowing steadily across the street, and I stopped without thinking, not out of habit, but because I chose to, because for the first time I was aware that even small pauses could be intentional, that not everything in my life had to be reactive or rushed. I glanced around, taking in the details I usually ignored, the flicker of a streetlight, the distant sound of music from somewhere down the block, the quiet hum of a city that never really stopped, and I realized that nothing out here had changed. Not the streets, not the people, not the world I had always known, but I had, and that difference was enough to make everything feel new. My phone buzzed softly in my bag, breaking through the moment, and I reached for it automatically, expecting something routine, a message from work, a reminder, something predictable. But when I looked at the screen, my breath caught for just a second, not because of who it was from, but because of what it represented, an unknown number, simple, unmarked, and yet I knew, without needing to question it, that this was not random. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because this was another moment, another choice, another point where I could decide how I moved forward, and instead of overthinking it, instead of stepping back in a hesitation, I answered, "Lily." His voice came through the line, the same calm, measured tone that had cut through the noise of the restaurant hours ago, and hearing it here, outside of that environment, made it feel different, more deliberate, more personal in a way I had not expected. "You left," he said, not as a question, but as an observation, and I found myself smiling slightly, not because it was amusing, but because it felt grounding, familiar in a way that reminded me this was not something I had imagined. "I did," I replied, my voice steady, matching his without trying, and there was a brief pause on the other end, not empty, not uncertain, just measured, like he was acknowledging that answer in the same way he had acknowledged everything else tonight. "Good," he said, and again, that simple word carried more weight than anything else could have, because it was not about approval. It was about recognition, about understanding that I had stepped forward in a way that mattered. I shifted my weight slightly, standing at the edge of the crosswalk as the signal finally changed, the white figure lighting up, and I stepped forward, crossing the street as I spoke, the city continuing around me, unchanged and yet entirely different. You said it depends on me. I said, not as a question, but as a continuation, as a way of acknowledging what we had already established. And there was no hesitation in his response. It does, he said, and I could hear something in his voice then, something subtle but unmistakable, not control, not expectation, but awareness, like he understood exactly what this moment meant without needing to define it. I reached the other side of the street, slowing slightly as I stepped onto the sidewalk, and I realized that whatever came next, whatever this connection turned into, it was not something that would pull me back into the person I had been. It was something that would challenge me to continue forward, to keep choosing, to keep remembering. I let out a quiet breath, steady and certain, and for the first time, I did not feel like I was walking into the unknown. I felt like I was walking into something I had already started to understand, something I had already chosen. Then I guess we will see what happens next, I said, and there was no fear in it, no hesitation, just a